Hi, Sasha. Welcome to the second episode of Within Orb. I'm so glad to be here with you. And before we jump straight into the questions of the day, I would love to hear a little more about your background in astrology and where you're coming from today.
Well, as a Libra, it's always very hard to try and talk about myself, as I'm sure you can understand. But I, first and foremost, identify as probably a writer at this point. But my background is in Hellenistic and psychological schools of astrology. Though in the recent years, I've veered away significantly from that and have actually pioneered what I call stellar witchcraft, which is incorporating traditional and folkloric approaches to witchcraft through the lens of fixed stars and perinatalanta, which was reprised and made much more popular thanks to the great research and works of Bernadette Brady. So that's where a lot of my heart lies now, writing the invocations, guiding people through cultivating stellar relationship and with the spirits of the other than human world that are identified with the stars themselves.
That's an amazing intersection of topics, and I cannot wait to read what you're writing. But before I get to that, I want to ask you, what is the first astrology book that you ever read?
Oh my God. It's gotta be like Linda Goodman. It's gotta be one of the first astrology book I ever read. I can't even remember what it was now, but I swear to God, I picked it up again, typical Libra, because it had to do with compatibility,
Okay.
like star signs and love or something like that. And it was from a Goodwill. And what I remember was that it cost all of my allowance. I was like maybe 11 or 12, and I brought this to my mom because I had a crush on a boy at school, and you knew I was going to find out how to make this person like me. So that is the origin. That's like the astrological villain like origin point
I
there.
love it. You spent
Yes,
all of your allowance. It was precious.
it was precious. I remember reading it at the time being like, okay, there's got to be more than this, but it definitely set me off on a pretty intense journey. And then there was also the birthday book, which I don't know if you remember those birthday books that came out
Yeah, they're
for a
huge.
while. Those giant,
Yeah.
huge, they're huge.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I had one of those when I was in sixth grade or something too. And I would bring it to school, and like literally my way of getting people to be friends with me at the time, because I was a weird kid.
Oh, that's
Not
Gordon
that this
White's
was
first
less
question.
weird, but yeah, not that this was like somehow less weird that I brought
Yeah.
this giant birthday book to school and would like ply people's friendship by reading them about themselves. But that was the first time I was like, oh, people like to hear about themselves.
Yeah.
I'm going to remember that.
That book's safe because it doesn't overtly say astrology. It's like
Yeah.
birthday, you're born on this day. Here's this stuff. And
But if you
it's
look at it, it's
spooky.
like sign and then like what things are associated with that sign. And then like there's the back sections of the book are like, oh, the people that are, Taurans, love fashion, all super
Yeah.
reductive stuff. But at the time, it was like a gateway drug.
Yeah. Did you find out
Astro
that you had a
coffee.
birthday twin?
Yes, but I found that out later, and
Okay.
actually, I think Gwen Stefani, I'm pretty sure, is a birthday twin, and I think it's Ashley Simpson.
Okay.
Um,
Who's
are
Ashley
birthday
Simpson? I feel
twins.
like I don't know
Is
anything.
Jessica
Who?
Simpson's sister.
Oh,
Which for the
okay.
millennials, we all will remember that SNL appearance wearing the failed dub. It was like one of those times that someone that was lip syncing actually got exposed for lip syncing.
Yeah. I'll
Iconic.
age myself. I remember that with Milli Vanilli at the
Oh my
Grammys.
God. I wonder if they had the iconic like Saturn ruled Deccan fallen sun
Oh,
to help expose their shortcut taking in the public eye. We'll have to.
that's something we'd have to research in the library, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah. Yeah. Okay. So you had entry into astrology books through these two sort of pop culture books, but if you were stuck on a desert island, what are the astrology books you'd bring with you?
I'm so glad you asked. I have gathered four for this purpose, and while this was very hard to decide, these are the ones that I think probably I refer back to the most, or most informed some of the directions that I took my own practice. So these are my go-tos. The first one, and everyone's going to be excited when they get to see the physical form of this, is 36 Faces by Austin Coppock, his exploration of all of the decans. And then I can I can share why I chose these after, but I'll just like introduce them first.
Okay,
Or
cool.
should I...
Yeah, as you wish, as you wish.
And then I'm gonna
So that's the number one. 36
That's the
Spaces is number one.
That's the number one because I don't know if I would have pursued astrology the way I had if it hadn't been for Austin's writing.
Wow.
And the sudden resonance of being like, this speaks to me. Yeah. I want to do this. And that was back in the MySpace dailies days.
Right.
And then my OG icon, my favorite of the ancients, Mr. Manilius with the Astronomicon, who taught me that actually poetry is an acceptable format for delineations and the communication of significations.
I love that.
And then Liz Green's Saturn, A New Look at an Old Devil, which was one of the pinnacle points for affirming the haunted houses system that I talk a lot about and that I presented at Astromagia on. Her incredibly robust and fortified way of exploring Saturn as more than like a stereotype, more than just a reductive, these things bad. Hugely anchored in that sort of deep psychoanalytic perspective that I really loved. Blew my mind, and I think I try to like force everyone around me, even people that didn't give a toot about astrology, to read it for quite a while. Now there's a moratorium. I'm not even actually allowed to talk about Saturn with most of the people in my life. So
wait. You're saying people in your life told you to stop talking about Saturn because you were talking about him too much?
Yeah, it got really out of hand for a while. Because 2-3 years ago or something, I started that Saturn devotional. This book was one of it, but I did like a whole year long every day during every Saturn hour. I was doing I went hard. I went too hard, and I learned there is definitely such a thing as too much Saturn. And now I'm in a Venus devotional here. Okay. We're trying to even the scales a little bit. But yeah, there was a moratorium. Like I started becoming a talking point. If I tried to bring it up, people told me that I had to go outside. I couldn't talk about it.
You literally got exiled from Saturn.
What did you say?
You literally got exiled from Saturn.
Yeah. Turns out people don't love talking about responsibility a lot of times or about like sacrifice and why sacrifice is so important to Halloween, our work and everything. You stop getting invited to parties.
I'm so sorry that happened.
I mean, I did it to myself. What do you?
Yeah, well, you went all the way. Okay, what's the last book on your list?
And that is going to be Bernadette Brady's Fixed Stars. And so much of my work is almost, I mean, at this point, sort of predominantly looking at the stellar spectrum of the firmament. And Brady, there are so many great treatises on the folklore and the myth, but to see it collected, to see the connections made, to see the real human examples extrapolated in this mythopoetic lens was so deeply moving to me as a person whose whole life like revolved around the necessity of fairy tales being true from you know, when I was a child to now, where most of my work is helping people to resource themselves within their own sort of enchanted forest, within their own process of catasterism. And seeing these splayed out with such a tender and passionate and reverent focus for the aliveness of these myths, I was like, this is the direction. This is what it is. I had spent all of my time rambling through this world of astrology and finding all these things that I loved and finding things that resonated and I gravitated toward. But it wasn't until a couple of years ago where I allowed myself this sort of journey into the fixed stars that I found, I think, like my place in astrology.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And I love that the fixed stars, that's like the beyond Saturn wheel in the cosmology, right? So it's like you did that Saturn work and you literally almost, you know, theurgically broke through to the other side.
Well, and there's a lot of things that were not super great about what like 3 years of deep Saturn devotional period went, right? And that was actually, it started when he was opposite my moon by transit, and teaching me in that way. But really, we often forget, I think, that Saturn is the gatekeeper of the stars, right? That he is the full access point to all the planets beneath him and to what is beyond him in the firmament. And I really do think that paying that sort of sacrificial pound of flesh to him, right, allows you access to legacy. And the stars ultimately are the legacy bearers of all story that has ever existed, from the Neanderthals to contemporary stories that we discover today, right? Like this is this beautiful topography, and Saturn as time himself shepherds us into that relationship, but not without the sacrifice. With everything is an initiation of some sort. Everything has to hurt. You have to lose a little of yourself along the way if you want the space to bring new things in.
Oh, you just did what I love about astrology and astrologers. You talked about everything in existence and non-existence in one breath. It's amazing.
Like thank you.
No, I know. It's just like, yeah, we're going all the way back to the origins of what we know to be human, right? And looking up, and our stories are embedded in these fiery balls that poke through the darkness of matter, right? Or whatever. And yeah, I just think that's a wonderful collection of texts that you have there. So let's go back to Austin for a minute and just sit with the 36 Deacons. What about that book, beyond his amazing writing, really shifted your perspective? You know, what is the sort of takeaway that you would impart to a new person who's never met that book? Like, why is it important to spend? It's also like, I think the second edition is on its way, but the edition you just held up has been sold out for years. So what is it about?
This was a precious gift from J.M. Hamadi. Well, it must have been about 4 years now ago. But so there's actually a lot to it. So, I mean, for those that have read it, know that there is a wealth of information, especially for talismanic purposes within it, about the certain dignities that planets can find in decanic phases, etc. But what really compelled me, beyond obviously Austin's incredible prose style, was how you managed to organize it in a way that was so full of depth, but also really accessible and like immediately applicable. I find that to be kind of a gold standard in a source book kind of component, where you can literally scroll to, okay, well, my sun is in the 3rd decan of Scorpio, and then read all this collection of esoterica that is written in a way so that you can use it, so that you can understand it and identify with it, but that it also opens up so many more doors for you to explore, whether it's different references that he might have to Buddhist traditions, or whether it's quoting different Islamic texts, right? Like there's just so much to go through. And even in the back index where he assigns the decans to different spirits. So if someone is wanting to ultimately, which is my primary interest in astrology, is how do we interact? How do we have relationships with spirits, right? Like all of these are living, breathing entities of creatures. And how do I get my hands dirty, right? How do I interact with something? He gives you these entryways, right? That are the deities that are associated, or even gods as he sees them, associated with the different decans as well. And that allows you to initiate some direct relationship with the idea of being in a living, deeply, deeply alive, like writhing with creation cosmos. That's so much more exciting, I think, than having to read flat significations or delineation. So you get a little bit of everything. You get what it means to be a magical practitioner, right? Because he being such a pillar in the astrological community, especially with the astrological magical renaissance too that we've seen, allowed me to be like, okay, wait, we can do magic with astrology, right? Like it's not, I don't have to divide these things. I don't have to have my magic practice on one side and my astrology practice somewhere else. As well as the thing that we also seek from astrology, which is personality identification, right? Like, oh, I do identify with being that kind of person. That makes sense that would be indicative of where my sun falls, right? And then to direction around how to engage, and how to engage in a safe way, right? With as little malefic fallout as possible, because he's explicit about where those things go. So that organization is so comprehensive, and I think so masterful prior to, it even being aware of how masterful it was going to be. And I know, like, as I work on my own individual writing products, I'm always kind of keeping that method in mind. Like, how can this be accessible? How can it be conducive to meaning making? How can it be conducive to relationship building? And like, how can we do that with causing as little backlash to our lives and the lives of those around us as possible?
Yeah, and I believe that book was published about 10 years ago, so it's been impressive to see it go from thought form in his mind to actually having an influence in this astromagical resurgence that we're seeing now.
Totally. Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I remember him talking about it and saying there's like kind of two camps, the occultists over here who eschew astrology, mostly because like the books that are in Kaylee, for example, are a lot of pop culture books that got published in the 60s, 70s, 80s that wouldn't appeal to somebody that was trying to do hardcore occult work, right? But there is in the history of astrology deeper, like a marriage of those two subjects. And so Austin making 36 Faces was trying to like bridge that in a modern context to show the occultists how useful astrology can be, and that almost like trying to make talismans without it is just like working in the dark, like work smart, not hard, right? So
totally.
Cool.
Yeah,
so
I can't imagine now. I mean, I don't even refer to it as much as I used to, but it's like when people ask like what are the items you would take out of your home if there was a fire, it's in the top 5 at this point.
Awesome.
It's got sentimental attachment too. Yeah,
for sure. But it's also nice to hear how it's influenced your own writing, and that it's been a role model for infusing things with utility but also responsibility. Again, there's that word. Totally. I feel like it's going to come up a lot today. And also just this awareness of poetry with something that's more practical. Speaking of poetry, oh yeah, no, it's not fluffy, but so Manilius, that's going all the way to the back. That's like, you know, Hellenistic Greece. Let's get in there.
Yeah. Get a little bit emotional about Manilius, actually. And there's been so many beautiful translations, but for me as someone that like came initially with a background as a like a published poet, as a creative writer, as an essayist, and tried to wiggle her way into creating a space sort of in the astrological milieu. Manilius, I was actually introduced to before I even tried to become like intentional in the public sphere of astrology, because I was doing Latin translation in my undergrad, and my Latin professor at the time actually had a list, right, that we could choose from, and a Latin translation of Manilius was just a section. And it was particularly him talking, I think, about in particular, the fixed star Alphecca and the people, like the children that are born under Corona Borealis. And I would later like find out that this is actually a very important star for me within my chart. But it's interesting too, right? With the stars as these will-o-the-wisps or like fufales or lighthouses, these literal light that takes us in the direction that we're meant to be going as part of a greater like destiny, as a greater direction, our own, you know, heroic arc. That was what this passage of translation for Manilius did. I've actually recently wrote an email to this professor to let him know, because he just chose from a random thing assortment that was in our library. But there is a emotional embodiment in Manilius's poetry that shows how deeply he understood planets, stars, zodiacal signs, the different delineations around these things, like in his body as lived things, as gods that were emergent for him, right? Not as abstract or hypothetical experiences, but rather the poetry of life itself. And beyond the form of it being in the prose state, the way that he moves language to show what is not able to be communicated explicitly, but only through metaphor, only through symbolism, only through heart space experience, right? That like, yes, I know that, I felt that, I see that within me, I saw that within this person. And I think this is one of the reasons why we could never have I don't think that we could really do astrology justice without recognizing his role within it as someone who seemed to be something of a priest of these spirits themselves. Like they came through him. There was oracular provenance in the way that he communicates and shares, as if he's telling stories of these stars, of these planets, as those stars and those planets themselves, right? Like this is, he's got the phone to this thing, and he's just getting it down. And that's one of the reasons why he really sticks with me, because I'm especially interested in the way these things show up in our spirits, and how they're creating this kind of great chain of being, so to speak, but on the microcosmic personal level as well.
It sounds like this poetic transmission has not been given enough credit for transmission has not been given enough credit for teaching the astrology in ways, because we expect when we're learning something, there's a textbook and it's sort of, this is how you do this and here's the instructions for that. And what I heard you in what you shared is more of a frenzy of experience, and the story itself washes over you and teaches you something that's not necessarily lodged in a kind of rational approach. It's like
absolutely
like
it's ecstatic, it's Dionysian.
Yeah, I think we're finally, maybe with this past year's conjunction of Uranus with the North Node in Taurus, we're like finally ready as a community for this type of honoring of our embodied wisdoms. And getting that direct experience that Manilius has captured for his time. And now you're doing it for our time in your way. Kind of. I'm hoping. I'm giving you a high charge there. Very cool. So yeah, I mean, I feel pressure. Like no pressure, but I mean, there's a through line to what your 4 books are on this desert island. I want to go to this desert island with you. There's a through line because there is an element of more of a subtlety, a softness, a roundness, a kind of meandering that is not just sort of a blasting, rational kind of like evidence-based situation. It's a different kind of evidence.
Yeah, there's a place for that, and there are astrologers and writers for that, and that was never going to be the role that I was able to occupy. And I'm so grateful for these astrological ancestors, or well, I mean, Austin's living, so not
he gathered the ancestors though, kind of like Agrippa, right?
But like this is the collective, right? Like as these ageless and timeless pillars that sort of hold up, like almost, if we were to think about what would the angles of my astrological practices, hypothetical nativity look like we would have probably these 4 people holding up the different spokes that made the thing turn.
Could you actually maybe read that passage about Alphecca just a little bit?
I do not think I have. That's not what the one that I have next to me, I don't think.
Okay.
I only have volume 1 next to me.
Hear a taste of it.
I wish I did. I could pull it up. I have it on my phone, but if you want,
let's hear some Manilius. Let's see what it sounds like. Just pick something. Bibliomancy. Go for it.
Hold on. Yeah, wait. I'm grabbing the Alphecca because I think it deserves it.
Okay.
And I have it saved. Almost there. Okay, so this is the specifically on Corona Borealis and Alphecca by Manilius. Corona, the crown's lustrous ring, which twinkles with varying luminosity, for the circle is dominated by a single star, Alphecca, which with passing splendor sparkles in the mild forehead and enhances with its blazing flame the bright lights of the constellation. They shine as a memorial of deserted Ariadne. Next to rise is Aragon. When you behold her ascending with 5 degrees wrested from the sea, there will emerge from the waves a bright memorial of what was once in her lifetime Ariadne's crown, and gentle will be the skills herefrom bestowed. For here shines a maiden's gifts. The child of the crown will cultivate a garden budding with bright flowers and slopes, gray with olive trees or green with grass. He will plant pale violets, purple hyacinths, lilies, poppies, which vie with bright Tyrian dyes, and the rose which blooms with the redness of blood, and will stipple the meadows with designs of natural color. Or he will entwine different flowers and arrange them in garlands. He will wreathe the constellation under which he was born, and like Ariadne's crown, will be the crowns he fashions, and stems he will squeeze sew together and distill mixtures, make perfume therefrom, and will favor Arabian with Syrian scents and produce unguents which give off mingled fragrance, that the charm of the perfume be enhanced by the blending. His heart is set upon elegance, fashion, and the art of adornment, upon gracious living and the pleasure of the hour. Such is the endowment prescribed by the years of the maid and the flowers of the crown.
Oh,
I know. It rips your heart open. It just destroys
it's so
it.
good.
His description too of Cetus and Menkar, where he describes salt as the venom of the sea. I was like, oh, what?
You could like start shriveling.
Yeah, but it's such a when you think about it, you're like, of course, right? Salt would be the venom of the sea. But when you hear it poetically, you're like, oh my God, how and where did you rend this from? Like your brain.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. I have not taken time myself to read it in full, so now you're inspiring me to pick it up.
You must.
Yeah.
It's just, especially with the constellations, his descriptions they'll make you weep.
Yeah. Let's hop over Saturn and get to Bernadette, because Bernadette's book of fixed stars also lays out the constellational myths. And so what is it about this one? I mean, it sounds like in your pre-introduction to these, that this was one that sort of actually truly set you off on your current path. Something about Bernadette's book.
The parents technique in general, I have heretically transformed into using for my own witchcraft purposes, including creating a sort of like I don't want to use the term horary, right? But a timing technique based around stars that show up on angles. So both the technique itself that she introduces within this fixed star book, the perinatal Lanta technique, as well as this incredibly expansive and almost kind of exhaustive at times exploration of folklore, of myth, of the way that these things are prescient, are always living and immortal within every single aeon and era of human existence is so inspiring, and it's so totalizing, and you kind of sink beneath the gravitas of it for a moment, and you just feel like humbled by how interconnected we are to everything that's come before, right? And while that can have that effect of making you feel perhaps like small at first, there's such a comfort in that, right? That safety blanket of eternity that like wraps around you so that you can find your small position within it, that you can find the stories that make up your own personal narrative within it. And for me, it was really pivotal because I noticed where there were gaps, right? Like she focused on so much rich Mediterranean, Levant, some North African, a lot of, the Greek and Roman mythos. But for me, only some of that reflects my ancestry, right? So it actually was part of what inspired me to go off and start doing a lot of deeper dives into the folklore and myths of different geographical regions too, and how those that under usually the term folk astronomy, right, is what you end up finding a lot of these books, especially the more academic and research related articles and books under the folk astronomy category, how these all help sort of substantiate and affirm and uplift as well the narratives that she was telling. There's real consistency there. There's something that's universal. And I think that we want to respect, of course, the inherent uniqueness and beauty of indigenous regions and how distinct everything can be. There's something that's really thrilling when you notice that, like, wow, this seems to be upheld, like this story, right, attached to this constellation, regardless of whether we're in Southeast Asia, regardless of whether we're in Glastonbury, this is a narrative that persists. And I think that for me is extremely thrilling on like a philosophical and a spiritual level.
I love how it has inspired you to see like you have to know a lot to know what you don't know and to notice something missing.
Yeah.
So it's really nice to hear like you have ancestry that's not contained within that book, but that's also a part of participating in the culture of producing your own one in the future, perhaps, or
Yeah.
a supplement to, or, you know, adding your vantage point to hers. And then as a collective, we actually can do a different kind of mapping of what we've been up to historically and then in the present, and making
Totally.
perhaps suggestions for the future.
Yeah, it lets me sit with clients, and when they come to me from ancestral backgrounds that aren't reflected in the myths and story collected, I have a pool that I can call from so that everyone finds their own home in the sky without feeling like they're being forced into someone else's kind of relationship.
Yeah, I like that. It's also in the beginning of Bernadette's book, she talks about the constellation of Draco and the tilt of the Earth's axis coming as a sort of like a astronomical analogy to this myth of falling out of the Garden of Eden and things becoming imperfect. And now we have the sidereal zodiac not matching the tropical zodiac, and just, you know, this is where we fall from grace. And I just really appreciated that insight into the hardcore astronomy being applied to this mythology and poetry.
Totally. Yeah, and there's so much. I mean, she's doing real astronomical work. So that's, I'll be honest, sometimes the part where I'm like, I have to reread this several times to understand what we're talking about. I'm also very appreciative that she includes so many charts, visual charts within the within the book too, so that you can.
You're talking about these crossovers. This, like, this is like the map of the constellation. But there's other charts. There's like a
when we were able to see, like, for instance, oh my god, it's funny.
Let's look at Alphecca. Let's stay focused on
I literally
Alphecca.
opened Alphecca. It's on the
page
116.
Okay.
So you can also understand what with the risings and the, you know, the different settings of the stars too, whether it's a chronicle, heliacal.
This map of heliacal rising and setting, it took me forever to figure out how to read it. It was not an easy thing. We see a graph here with a crossover of an X with, it's like one line goes down and solid and the other line comes up and it's dotted. And then you see for different latitudes and degrees of the zodiac, where exactly this star will be rising and setting throughout the year. And
well, and she's got the flow charts too, right? That are like also super useful.
Yeah.
I mean, and especially for me, because it's always the technical stuff that my brain, like, the story is the words, the meaning making, that's the easy part. But like astrology is an observable, you know, like we're, and especially fixed stars, right? Especially Paranormal, we're trying to stick to the observable phenomena. And it's really important that you can locate yourself within the astronomy of the practice that you are engaging in, from also this more creative way as well.
Yeah, and it's also bringing up, even through the math and all of the really robust hard science of the astronomy behind this book, it ultimately comes down to a sensitivity of location, where you are now.
Yeah.
You have to be absolutely sensitive to your horizon, your vantage point, your location on this surface. And if you need to change that, you need to go somewhere else. And I love that about it. Like, it's like sensitive.
I always get a thrill when I have clients from below the equator, like, that were born, and I always get to like discuss some different stars too. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
I mean, that's part of the thing that you've talked about too, right? When we're looking at the astro
locality,
geography and cartography part of stuff, is okay, you don't like how things are going, leave where you are, find a place that's going to bring that in for you too. And you can do that as much for the constellations as you can for different planetary lines too.
That's amazing. Yeah, I can see that. And I've taken a look through fixed stars specifically to just see in certain places what is the chain link of heliacal rising and heliacal setting stars, and noticed that certain stars will never heliacal rise in the north, but they do in the south at the opposite rate of them going the setting from the north to the south. And it's like, there's like a sort of, if you really spend time with it, it actually becomes another way of knowing this community of people, stars, in this way that you kind of get their behavior. Like, they actually have regular behavior. We just, it's hard to do 72 pieces of information versus the, you know, classic 10. But if you take it bit by bit, as you have, and you sort of spend time with Alphecca, like, everybody who's listening, go back and look into see what you can learn about Alphecca. it just, then they slowly become your friend, right? And you start to get to meet them, and you're
Totally.
like, oh, Sirius is success which can burn. And you kind of get a sense of these,
Yeah.
like, what do
Or
they
yeah, you'll
do?
get a fixation
Yeah. Yeah. And
and you'll
then
see people start showing up in your life with those stars to teach you about them too.
really,
Yeah, I'll be like, oh man, I need to learn more about Capella, and then it'll turn out I have like a week straight of only people with like significant Capella presence within
oh
their
wow.
parents, or like Capella conjunct, a luminary or something too. The stars are, and I book out pretty far in advance, so it's really creepy to me when it was like, oh, this was not coincidental that I decided this week I wanted to learn about a thing. I was being told, like, hey, heads up, refresh yourself a little bit because you're going to learn about this thing this week,
Yeah. Yeah. But
And
that just
that's also
shows
a
me,
really exciting experience.
for sure. But I think that's part of astrology being sentient.
Yes,
As a
absolutely.
practice, it's like you engage with it and it responds, and then it's like, all right, here's what's next. Here's what's next.
Totally. Totally.
So I have something to show you. For your last book, you picked, well, there's third to last, but whatever. Um, Saturn, A
Oh
New
my
Look at an
God.
Old Devil. I've got these like first and second edition covers here.
Oh my God. Want to get my hands on them.
Yeah, you got to
So I'm
come
at
to
the
the
library.
Kaylee. I know. So, I mean, look at the detail here. This is like
I know.
oh, a man
Conserving
holding,
hermit card realness.
yeah, holding a chalice and a lamp, and has wings and jot matrix etching, and oh wow, horns, the whole thing. So let's talk about Saturn. I'm inviting you to talk about Saturn one last time. This book, this was a definite game changer in the world of astrology at the time, wasn't it?
It is such a humanizing book. The as someone, one of my first real passions and my graduate degree experience involved were around psychoanalysis, right?
Mhm.
Especially Freudian and Lacanian, but Jung was in there, of course, as well. And to read Liz Green's like deeply knowing, deeply felt sense understanding of like what it means to be human, and the ways in which, as Freud initially meant it, like psyche means the spirit, the soul of a person, and psychoanalysis is about understanding the soul of a person. I think she exemplifies that as a craft, as an art, so expertly, especially when we're talking about a planet that is the greater malefic, right? That is associated with a lot of the most traumatic, harrowing, and difficult, or least fun and pleasurable, aspects of being a human that has to live on a planet with other humans.
Mhm.
And she does a really elegant kind of choreography around being honest and blunt about how these obstacles can present themselves, while also at no point does she create a sort of fatalistic experience that condemns the opportunity for human redemption, right?
Mhm.
There's I remember, I forget who it was a medical text that Vanessa Irena sent me once that was talking about Saturn as the redeemer of mankind. And that really stuck with me. And I really do feel that's true, though it might not be an overt sort of association that we come to, right?
Mhm.
Uh, and I think that Liz does a really, we're on a first name basis, does
Liz
a
Green.
does a really great job at showing this sort of Sisyphean ordeal, this sort of Sisyphean obstacle of like suffering is inevitable. Everywhere, everyone has the wound, everyone has Saturn in their chart, and therefore, too, there is resource, there is strength, there is initiation, there is lesson, and there's something really profound. And I think that even when we don't like certain people or we have conflict with others, we can all sort of connect over that universal kind of signature of pain and the things that we learn and the ways that we try to live in spite of, despite it, and because of it. So
Wow. How would you marry your knowledge of traditional essential dignity to Liz's version of Saturn? Meaning, for example, like someone with Saturn in Leo or Cancer versus someone with Saturn in Aquarius or Libra, and these types of sacrifices and threshold experiences.
Well, the thing that for me was most valuable about this book was her exploration of Saturn through the houses in particular. And that was it inspired directly a lot of my investigation into planets in these haunted houses, as I call them. Because I recognized the first time I read this, and I read the delineation for Saturn in the fourth house, which I don't have, but which many of the people that I've been closest to in life had. I noticed everything she said so incredibly on point that I was like, okay, wait a minute. And that the tenderness too. I don't even at this point specifically remember what she spoke of Saturn through the signs, because I think at this point I've created a lot of my own delineations. The first time I read this must have been about 8 or 9 years ago. But I remember in particular the way she talked about Saturn also conjunct certain planets and how that translated. There are certain things I will say that I do not think have perhaps aged in ways that people would now feel super comfortable with, as we especially have become more sensitive to neurodivergence and the way that can show up. And we try not to sort of necessarily read these signatures into the chart, but rather take people as whole and organic, entities. But that's bound to happen pretty much with any person who is creating a meaning that we will eventually one day have more information about, right?
Yeah.
And that's actually a thing that psychoanalysis in general would benefit from allowing too, right? Is for people to grow and for our ways of experiencing people to grow. But the anchorage that she used in real case studies and client examples, both in a therapeutic context where she's examining people in their full life, right? Not just within the hour in the consultation room we receive when we're looking at the nativity, but also the duration of knowing people's unconscious in such a complex and extended period of time, I think made it a book that will be one of a kind and useful forever.
Yeah.
I may be so old.
Always a new look at an old devil, maybe.
Yeah, I would love for there to be like I would have loved for this on every planet.
Yeah. She does have other books on planets. The Neptune book is enormous. I'm not sure if you've ever seen that one.
This in particular, I feel like this approach she took was pretty unique. But I think out of maybe every planet, Saturn was the one that most deserved having this exploration, or needed it, or we needed it.
Yeah, for sure. So if you were, let's pivot hard now, you're off the desert island. If you were going to give somebody recommendations of how to get into astrology via a book, what book would you point them to?
If it was star related, I would of course point to Brady if people are trying to learn from the techniques. But I often find that the best way to get into astrology is through not studying just astrology. I often recommend that when people tell me like, oh, I would love to learn more about, for instance, like the way I do things, right? I'm obviously not speaking for every astrologer or astrologer. But when people ask me like, okay, well, how did you get into this? How and why do you do it? I'll tell them the books that really were like a core of my self-study education, and I'll recommend them to you or Austin for your classes as well if they want to learn it that way. But I always tell them to look to fairy tales, to folklore, to philosophy, to psychoanalysis, having a better understanding of all the different ways that everyone has seen the world work, that everyone sees people work, these sort of stories, these sort of concepts, these ways of making meaning, I think are ultimately the foundation of what is most beneficial to mankind about astrology. And in order to be the best sort of astrologer you can be, having a well-rounded library of things that make you go, oh yeah, or I know how to apply that, or that reminds me of something, right? Those are the things that I think give people a unique voice in their astrology, so that they aren't just reciting delineations that they read from a book that really inspired them, but rather they're able to facilitate and create something totally new, and therefore add something that no one else can. And that's what I think makes astrology a richer environment So that was a long way of answering your question, only half of the way, I think. But
no, yeah, you're basically saying there's no answer to that question, and read everything else except an astrology book.
Yeah, and also you can read the astrology books, but don't stop with the astrology books if
Right.
you want to learn astrology. It's
Yeah.
I think at the end of the day, astrology is about stories, whether
Mm-hmm.
those are the stories we tell ourselves or whether those are stories we tell others, or how we interpret the stories of, you know, the time period that we are in. And for that, you need to be able to pull on other stories.
Right, right. And you can see it too. I mean, just, you know, touching back on Liz, I love it when there's a reference to some aspect of, in my experience, German culture, right? And it's sort
Yeah,
of like she went there and she's bringing it into context with all of this
totally.
astrological lore. You know, it's not just a sort of dry run, you know, Saturn, 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 Saturn. It's like, oh, check this out. This happened in Germany. Like all the German writers like to say I was born under the sign of Saturn. Like they just, that's like a hallmark of like, you've
Yeah.
made it. If you get published and the opening line of your book is you were born under the sign of Saturn. Walter Benjamin did it. Goethe did it. So it's like this whole thing in Germany, at least with Saturn, you know? And so, yeah, I think, you know, you're totally right on in that way, in the sense that, like, I think what makes reading certain astrologers amazing is that they have brought in their own cultural frames and they're bringing
Yeah.
more to the table than just rote astrology, if as if astrology is one kind of practice. I'm not even trying to suggest that by any means, but I think, you know, when you talked about Austin, he's bringing in his magical praxis and all of the exposure he's had to different cultures and his desire and curiosity about other cultures. Yeah,
Totally.
so yeah, that's a hard answer.
Yeah, the astrology is going to be elicited through the vessel of the astrologer, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
that's why nourishing and feeding and deepening the realm of the astrologer's own interest is so vital to a sustaining voice, a voice that doesn't also just burn out after a while as well. Just you must consume experience, you must consume meaning, and you must consume everything you see around you is information that you at some point will use, that you might need, you know. And it's worth opening the spectrum of your vision and not being sort of myopic, I think, even in the beginning, because everything can be a part of your astrology at some point.
Love that. Well, thank you so much for taking time,
of course,
to talk about your love of certain astrology books and also so many other texts and textualities and poetics and poems. And I look forward to what you end up writing and contributing to this textual world of star stuff.
Thank you. More coming soon.
Okay. Have a wonderful day.
Bye.